you got to be contributing and adding value, or you begin to question yourself.
That was Holli Harrington, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at the Indianapolis International Airport Authority, talking about how transparency, authenticity, and value for all people are key to any successful corporate DE&I initiative. And this is IBJ's The Freedom Forum with Angela B. Freeman. So Holli, it's so good to have you here. I'm so excited to speak with you today, and I'd like you to tell our listeners a bit about you, your educational and professional background, and any other factors that led to you becoming the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at the best airport in North America as established for the last decade, the Indianapolis International Airport Authority. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Angela. Ooh, where do I start? I tell my kids I've been here longer than I'm going to be here, so just a lot of stories to share. So I am a native of Detroit, Michigan, but I have been in Indianapolis for the last 30 years. Mm-hmm. Thought I was going to be here for 6 years, fell in love, and 3 kids later, I guess I can say I'm a Hoosier.
Yeah.
I left Detroit in '86. And went to Howard University in Washington, D.C., and studied mechanical engineering. So we can talk a little bit later about how do you go from engineering to diversity. So I would say diversity chose me. I did not know this is what I was going to do when I left Howard University, but I would say my experience created a perfect storm that positioned me to do the work of supplier diversity, which led later to me becoming the diversity officer at the Indianapolis Airport.
Yep.
So I would say it was not my goal, but it has become my passion.
Yeah.
And I feel really blessed that what I do every day makes a difference for so many other people. My path in the field of diversity was because people said, hey, I got an opportunity for you. I think you can do this. And it started at our old employer, Eli Lilly, when I was doing engineering work. And they were like, well, we want more individuals from Howard University to come. And so I started working on the Howard University recruiting team. So going back and pulling more students. And in order to do that, you got to make sure your house is in order. And so we had a team of women from Howard, and we worked together, and we went back and did recruiting. But once we brought other students in, we tried to mentor them and make sure that they could be successful in the organization as well. And then that led to, again, getting a tap on the shoulder saying, we want you to do recruiting for all of manufacturing and quality. So I got to do recruiting, but really had a focus on how do you bring in more diverse candidates in the trades as well as in the professional positions. So that was really, really cool. And then got another tap on the shoulder and said, hey, you've done a pretty good job of recruiting people. Do you think you could do businesses? And that's what landed me in the supplier diversity job. So I would say when I went into the role, I knew a little bit about minority business, women-owned business, veteran-owned businesses, but not to the extent, that I do now. And I always tell people, I share stories about how recruiting people and businesses are very similar, and your approaches, especially for diversity, have a lot of the same approaches, that you can't look at all in the same places. Right. So just like they had to go to a HBCU, sometimes you got to go, I call it, you got to fish in a different pond if you want to find a different fish. If you keep going to the same pond and you never find it and you don't move, then, what do they call it?
Same fish.
They call it insanity, right? You keep doing the same thing and expect something different. So in this journey of equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's that same approach. If you keep doing the same things and you don't get your results, then you've got to kind of come back. And I think at Lilly we call it plan, do, check, act. You got to shift and pivot so that you can find something else. Your experiences shape your perspective, and then your perspective shape your attitudes as well as your actions. So when you broaden your experiences, then you can have different perspectives. And sometimes it even causes your actions and your attitudes to change.
Absolutely.
And so that's... It should. Right. So that's kind of what has happened across my career as well as in this role of how do you change culture and how do you get people to learn more about one another so they can be more accepting.
You know, we talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the context of getting more diverse people in your workforce, right? But supplier diversity kind of takes that to another level, and we have not spoken a lot about that on this show. And so I want to ask you to tell us a little bit more about supplier diversity and why that's an additional layer of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that many more sophisticated companies or more advanced companies who've kind of gotten beyond, okay, we just need to diversify our workforce, are implementing to make sure that they continue to recruit diverse businesses that you mentioned. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, one of the things I like to say is people really seem to understand the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workforce, right? And so you heard me say earlier, there's a lot of parallelism between supplier diversity and recruiting. So if you start thinking about the workforce, one of a class I actually took when we were at Lilly, one of the scenarios they shared is if you were building a team, do you want it to look just like you or do you want it to be different? Then they added another component to it. If you were building a team to compete in the game of Trivial Pursuit, do you want everybody like you?
Right.
And the answer is obviously no. You need somebody with sports. You need somebody who knows trivia. You need somebody who might know pop culture, depending on the version of the game you got. So it shows you that you need to bring all different perspectives. And so that applies to the workforce, but it also applies to your business and your construction contractors, to your professional services, as well as your supplies. You want the people that you're buying from to look like the people you're trying to serve.
Right.
Because then you're going to get better products. So I know a lot of people focus on diversity of thought, but it's also experience. You bring whatever your life experiences are. And if you look at where I am today, our customer could be from anywhere, right? And so we want to make sure the quality of customer service and experiences we are providing is what that person needs. And what I think a lot of us were taught our whole life is what we call the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. When in essence, it's the platinum rule is treat others the way they want to be treated. But to do that, you have to figure that out.
Right.
So a lot of times we're like, hey, I know I would want this. And so then we apply it, not realizing that might be, you know, not what somebody else needs. So from a supplier diversity perspective, I always say it was a journey. So initially there were minority-owned businesses saying we're not at the table. And if you think of, you know, the current big box stores, you know, you've got, I don't want to say names again, but you know what I'm talking about. But then you have the little small mom and shop corner stores.
That's right.
If you don't support those stores, people don't realize there are more people employed by the mom and pop and small businesses than they are the big box stores. And so we've got to make sure that there's a balance. Otherwise, we're going to put the small mom and pops kind of out of business, which is going to have a negative impact on our economy. So when you think about that, and when you start scaling, small businesses can seem big to us based on the number of people working there, but when you look at their market and their company's a lot bigger. So think of restaurant franchises. When you got somebody and there's 3 businesses in your state, and then you try to compare that to somebody who has franchises nationally. They may be big to us, but they're small in the bigger
comparatively
thing, everything. So it's just important that we support everyone because that has a huge impact on our economy.
I'd like to ask you, what do you believe is one of the best or the greatest lessons you learned in your first career while focusing on supplier diversity with that engineering background that prepared you for your current DE&I role?
The different opportunities that I was given as an individual to work in engineering, to work in human resources, to work on a strategic sourcing initiative, to work in procurement, really positioned me to see the supplier diversity and equity and inclusion from all different sides. So I think that kind of prepares you to see the inequities in all the different aspects.
Yeah.
And what I would say I learned is sometimes things are intentional and sometimes things are very unintentional.
Yeah.
So sometimes people put things in place to help someone, not realizing it has an
Sure.
adverse impact to another group.
Sure,
and
sure.
I can share an example in recruiting. We used to have the get and keep teams, and we were talking about how do you find, and assess technical skills. I can share with you personally, I was told I probably wouldn't be a good engineer based on some assessments and tests that were done, and they focused around automotive and, funny enough, aviation. Well, I could do a lot with a sewing machine. I could do a lot with a refrigerator. My interest wasn't in cars or planes at that time, but the assessments weren't around that skill set.
Right.
So when you think about some of the things that we do in a work environment, we will create processes and systems for what we think someone should know, not realizing that we're really limiting. If you didn't have that kind of experience, then you're not even brought to the table.
That's right.
And so it opened my eyes, because I would say a lot of people felt things were done always intentionally. So I don't want to, some things are,
Yeah.
but sometimes we play a role in bridging that gap and helping people understand, well, hey, I'm still capable, I'm still competent.
Yeah.
I don't want to do this, but I'm really good at that.
Yeah.
And that's when you get that broader diversity, in. And I would say that was the biggest lesson that I learned, is to kind of manage the own chip on my shoulder.
Yeah.
And try to turn situations into opportunities to educate people, because
absolutely.
sometimes they didn't mean to insult you.
Yeah.
One of the stories I always tell is I did a capital presentation to try to get support from the leadership team to give me money on a project. And when I was done, the comment that was made is, you speak really well.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people can relate, and I could have gotten upset, but my comment was, well, I thought you only hired the best, so wouldn't you expect me to speak well?
Right.
And the person kind of sat back, and they said, well, you're correct. And I said, well, the bigger question on the table was, did I get the money?
Yeah.
Are you going to support my project?
Right.
And so how you have to bring it back. So creating the balance. But when things are intentional, you have to deal with those straight on.
That's right.
And it's a big burden to bear when something does happen from a conflict standpoint. If you have the opportunity to change perspectives, make somebody aware that they've done something, even though it wasn't intentional, that was offensive, we have got to own it and use that as an opportunity. Some people will lean in and go, oh, I didn't mean that. And some people, they did that on purpose. But then that helps you figure out how to navigate through those situations.
That's right. You learn who people are, exactly.
Yeah.
So one thing you touched on there, Holly, again, I just want to pull out, is the assessment. You basically talked about the inequities and often disparities in the assessment of people for whatever skill set. I know we see that a lot in legal, where, okay, maybe they didn't get all A's, but they worked a part-time job, they did this. There are other things that speak to a person's potential. And I think oftentimes we, particularly as diverse people, don't necessarily fit in the box of the assessor, because we have skills and experiences and backgrounds that aren't being assessed. Jimmy and I talk so much about grit. Like, it is a real thing. Grit ought to be a real assessment tool, because one thing Black folks got is grit. We got that if we don't have anything else. And that's not to say that should supersede the academics and the community service and all the other things, but it should be a real assessment tool that, I think just isn't really employed here. So I appreciate you bringing that out, because I think oftentimes many businesses, when they're saying we can't find the diverse candidate, we can't find, maybe the tools and the assessment factors that you're, comparing them to or evaluating them on aren't really made to, factor or rate them at a high enough place that you feel like they're a good candidate. Maybe your assessment should be, and evaluation should be revisited.
Well, one of the things that I think is a debate is, should you hire for potential or proven
record. Yeah.
And so one of the things that were noted is that minorities and women are typically promoted and hired based on a proven track record, where white males traditionally were coachable, and so someone would give them an opportunity saying, I'm confident that they could do it.
Yeah.
And so those are some of the things that you've got to look at and say, hey, am I only selecting people based on their proven, or
Right.
when do I make the exception? And when I make the exception, what does that group look like?
Yeah.
And so how do you, create more balance? And that's the whole concept of being intentional.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
making sure you're true to what you're doing. No different than you and I. If you look at our circles, it's primarily black women and black men, right? So when we're looking for somebody, you're going to bring in who you know, and the other part of it is they're representing you.
Absolutely.
So you've got to figure out, how do I have more people who are diverse making decisions so they can bring in the people
Right.
that they know the best. But I think sometimes it's a stretch when we talk about, well, you need to go and hire folks, in other places. Yeah, you need to, but human nature, people are not going to hire someone that they don't think would represent them well, or they don't think could do the job. So that's why it takes a multitude of people. You got to realize, well, I don't know people in this culture.
Yeah.
I'm not exposed, so I need
right.
to go get someone
That's right.
on part of this team that can help make the best decision and bring people who will fit into these organizations.
Yeah.
If the people who are making the decision all look the same, we know we're going to have inequities.
What is specifically related to your position at the airport that likely differs from your standard DE&I leadership position roles in other Indiana corporations that are not related to international travel or tourism? And what do you feel empowers you or enables you to really make change at the airport with regard to diverse representation, leadership, engagement, some things you've already talked about within your organization, not just internally, but also with external suppliers and partners, which you have a background in?
Yeah, one of the things I would say at the airport is it's a group effort. So it's something that we all own and we work together. We have strategic pillars on economic impact, which is where supplier diversity is. We have workforce development, which is where HR and our workforce initiatives are. And we have on community engagement. But we work together. And so you can have examples of Indiana Black Expo. We can leverage them from a recruiting perspective. That's a way we engage back in the community.
Sure.
So we're also finding talent, but we're also reaching out to minority businesses and teaching them how to navigate at the airport and how to do their bids and what they need to do to get access to the system so that they can have access to opportunities. So when you're all working together, it has a greater impact. So you think of it as a tree. So you got a tree and then all these branches. And when you're all out trying to help one another, you have a broader collective impact. Yeah. And that's what I would say. I mean, one of the things a lot of folks talk about is the art program at the Indianapolis Airport. And they'll come to me and say, oh, you did a great job. And I said, no, I work with people who get it.
Yeah.
So the public affairs, marketing, and communication was already reaching out, working with Madam C.J. Walker.
Yes.
And I told them of how much of an impact that had on me as a Black female to walk in my place of work
Absolutely.
and see a 75-foot
beautiful.
image. But I can't take credit. My partners, my team did that. Not the diversity team, but the leadership team.
Doesn't that make you love your place of work so much more? Where all the diversity efforts don't just fall on your shoulders. I feel the same way. I just went to an art exhibit at Barnes last night. I had nothing to do with it. One of my best friends, Faith Blackwell, was there, and I got to support her. And it was awesome to be at my work home supporting diverse artists and diverse vendors, and I personally had nothing to do with it. That's an amazing feeling, because that's when people really buy in. It's not you trying to push diversity, equity, and inclusion. People really buy in. And I know Mario, and I know Megan and Maggie. I know you work with a powerful team who truly believes in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But again, everybody isn't blessed enough to work with such a team. And there are many DE&I officers sitting in meetings most days rather than talking about how we can impact the community, trying to convince folks on their own team why DE&I actually matters and counts.
Yeah, that's a big issue when you go into work every day and you're trying to justify why you need to do what your job description says. It distracts you from actually getting the work done.
Yeah.
And what I think is great at the airport, there's an alignment and there's a synergy, and we all know what we're working for. So at the end of the day, the why is we're trying to create a better customer service experience for everyone.
Right.
We want our employees to feel like they are valued and they belong. Our values are respect, integrity, trust, and excellence. And so that's what we do as an employee base. But we also are trying to extend that out to any passenger, any guest that is coming through our facility. And so I can say every day I walk into work, I love my job. I feel like I'm making a difference. But the key thing is I am in a place where I can be my true self.
Yes.
And my true self is valued by my leadership and my peers. And it doesn't mean we get along every day. We have different perspectives, different feelings, but we can talk them out. And at the end of the day, we still walk out as friends.
Yeah.
And that's huge.
Yes. You said earlier, when there are issues that come up or situations that come up, you have to face those head on. And you also just mentioned how you have the ability to walk into work every day and be your authentic self, and that is valued. And so many diverse people just don't have that, right? So how necessary is transparency and authenticity in order to truly effectuate corporate DE&I policies that really change the game with regard to employee fairness and equity and advancement? And are there limits on authenticity and transparency? And when I say that, I mean, we are Black women. There are plenty things that we do in our home, with regard to our hair, how we get together, that isn't for everybody to know, right? It's authentic, it's real, it's how we handle ourselves and take care of ourselves. Don't know that it always needs to be on the front page or of the newspaper or in your workplace. So I do want you to speak to that. I say that question particularly for you because while, yes, you need to be authentic and transparent in your workplace, I've seen that go a bit too far where I've had to pull some young bucks aside and be like, okay, now you can keep that at home. This is not the place or the time for that. Speak to it.
I would say, and you know me well, it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
One of the sayings one of my mentors used to say is those who have the goal makes the rules, right?
Yeah.
So you've got to know what environment you're in and if people are going to be receptive, but you also have to be true to yourself.
Right.
I've been in both situations where you been your authentic self and it's that shock factor.
Yeah.
What I can say is I'm blessed, and I tell a lot of people, I'm always my authentic self, and it has served me well at some times, and it meant at other times people weren't ready, or couldn't relate, and we had to have some difficult conversations. So I think it's important that you be true to yourself. Yeah. And don't get lost in trying to give people the right answer and then lose yourself.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot of minorities, Black and Hispanic folks trying to fit in and conform and just lose themselves and be miserable. And mental health can really impact the minority communities when you're trying to fit in someplace that may not value you. And I think once you realize when somebody doesn't appreciate you or value you when you're being your true self, that's not healthy.
Yeah.
And so I really think it is a challenge, and that's why my earlier comments were about try to figure out how to educate. When you're mad about something, figure out why are you mad. Pause for a moment and figure out why don't they understand why I'm mad. If you look at the course of events, especially with George Floyd and all that had happened, became a movement where people began to share. And the saying I use is it was on people's streets. So our reality was on the front page for the whole world.
Right.
And while it's sad it took an event like that, it opened up the doors for a lot of conversation, where people are like, well, why are Black women crying? I said, that's somebody's father, brother, son.
Absolutely.
And when we saw that, we know every day our father, brother, son, uncle could go out and that could be their reality.
Absolutely.
And so it kind of shocked us.
Yeah.
And, when you hear people talking about it, you're like, hey, why don't you ask me? Why don't you let me share, what that means, to me? And I think now we have to make sure that it's not just a moment, but it's a movement.
Right.
And that we continue to educate people on just because I'm different than you doesn't make me wrong. Just because you don't want to roll like I do doesn't make you wrong.
Yeah.
We can coexist. You are who you are.
Right.
I may not understand everything you went through, but you have a lot to offer. And so we have to be open that people who are not like us can do great things.
Sure.
And we have to figure out, are we being an enabler or are we a barrier to someone else? And it's something that you have to think of kind of constantly of, okay, I saw this young person and, you talk about even millennials now. They're very different than us.
Oh, yeah.
They have a different experience, but are we so set in our ways that we're limiting them? Mm-hmm. That's another form of inequity. Yeah. We just don't understand why they want to be on social media all the time, why they want to tell other people, but there is good that can come out of that. It's a lot like COVID. While a lot of people had to go home, think of where we're at doing things virtually that we never thought.
That's
people
right.
are effective not being all in a group. Now, there's some settings where we need to work together, but positive things. We wouldn't be using Teams like we are now. Right. We wouldn't be Zooming, like we are. I mean, even the podcast, people are able to take time to sit and learn. Yes. Where we were so busy and caught up in life. So I know I've gone kind of all around, but all of that is to say, not only do you need to figure out how you can be your true, transparent, authentic self, but you need to make sure you're not being a barrier to someone else trying to be their self.
I think we have a responsibility to encourage our young folks to be their authentic and transparent selves, but also in a way that is going to benefit and advance them, not, cause barriers and challenges. But I think the best way we do that is by doing that ourselves, right? By demonstrating that you can be your authentic self and still be in an executive environment and be valued and respected for being just that, right? Yep. I think we've both had opportunities to be in environments where you see what that value looks and feels like. And once you get that taste of an environment and a team and a company and an organization where you do feel valued, where your opinion actually matters, where they want to hear your perspective, it's really, really hard to go back to something else. And it's apparent very quickly that, oh no, this isn't the environment. I can already tell by the side conversations, or I can tell by, and you're a lot more apt and quick to leave because you know what that environment feels like. So I want to talk about that. We had Angel Henry on our show several months ago, and Angel, has written a book about Black women in STEM and their experiences. But I think many of those experiences apply to Black women, whether they're in STEM or they're in whatever industry. And she talks a lot about the emotional trauma of dealing with a corporate environment where you're not allowed to be your authentic self, where that is not valued, and how over time that takes such a toll. We are at a point where we've seen, we know, we've done it, enough women who finally decided, okay, that's it. It's time to make a change. I can't do this anymore. And so I want to talk about that because I think we know women typically stay in relationships too long, and that's what it is. Whether it's your employer or a husband or a partner, it's a relationship. And when you've been in any relationship for years and years, it's hard to leave because you know what you know. But talk to us about when you know it's time to make a move. Give some encouragement to ladies out there who may be listening to this, who are in that space, right? You and I have both been there. And let them know there is life on the other side. We're living it, and we're both happier. But in that time, it's hard. It's hard. And it is scary as all get out. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, it is. It is very hard. What I would say, what I would tell my younger self, because we went through a lot, is, when you go to buy a house, you have certain things that you want. Like for me, I wanted brick. I wanted a basement. What are the things that are really important to you? So not, for a house, but for you and your career. And it took me over 20 years to figure out what was really important was not money, but coming in, that's what I thought. It was all about the money. But it wasn't the money.
Everybody's chasing money when you're young.
Yeah, so, my advice is, money is great, but when you go, if you're driving home crying or feeling like you want to cry, is it really worth it? So work-life balance was important. If you spend 8 hours at least at a job, and if it is pure hell, you're bringing that home to your family. So work-life balance is something that I think people need to evaluate if they're trying to figure out, do they need to pivot? Because if you don't have something happy at the end of the day, it can just beat you down, or you're going to take it out on the people that you really care about and you really love, and it has nothing to do with them. The other part is, at work, do you feel valued?
Right.
Again, and value is not always money. What I always like to put the caveat on is there is pay equity. You don't want somebody to love your job and not get paid for it.
Right.
But when I'm talking about value for this is, are my ideas being heard? Can I implement, the things that I want to do, or is somebody constantly telling me no?
Right.
And I've got to implement something else. So I'm more of a robot than a contributor.
Right.
You got to be contributing and adding value, or you begin to question yourself.
Yeah.
And then you put that along with these performance evaluation process. And when somebody tells you so many times that you're average or below average, you might actually start playing into that. So you're not living your potential. You're not doing your best because somebody is always telling you your best is not good enough.
Yes.
So when you're not being valued, you've got a hard decision to make. So the other thing is, are you passionate? Do you love what you do? Or do you feel like you're making a difference? So those are kind of my three things. Like the house is, I need a work-life balance.
Yeah.
I need to make sure I feel like I'm valued and I'm contributing.
Yeah.
And I need to feel like my work is making an impact and I'm making a difference.
Yeah.
You may not have all of them all the time, but if you are missing one, but you see light at the end of the tunnel, you can get past it. But if you're missing two, you're probably going to be miserable. And that, again, I personally think that's really going to have an adverse impact on your own mental health. Yeah. You're going to take it out on the people that you really love, because you can't take it out on the people who you work with.
Right.
And you've got to evaluate what are those things for you, and you've got to have a process where you pause and look at your career and say, where am I? Mm-hmm. Do I have two of them? And that's what we're not good at. We're so busy cranking and working, but you're not pausing. And that's why the support groups, so we had the affinity group that bonded us together, that allowed us to have a whole nother set of conversations.
That's right.
You got to figure out how to create those support groups through your friends, through work colleagues. When I was in my mode, there were some women who lifted me higher than I saw myself and gave me the strength and the courage to say, I'm out.
Yeah.
We need to do that. So you've got to put yourself around people who see the best in you, and you've got to go to them and saying, hey, is this a good situation? Because sometimes, you can't see the forest for the trees. You see the prestige, you see the authority, the position. But at the end of the day, you're not really in a position where you're contributing like you could.
But I I also want us to speak to the Indiana corporate leadership, because I truly do believe, one of the good things that came from George Floyd and all that travesty is the realization of true inequities and disparities in corporate America with regard to diverse people and particularly diverse women. I tell people now, Black women and diverse women are as in as we're ever going to be. If you're thinking about making a power move, right now is the time to make it. And so I think that also shifts the dynamic a bit with regard to corporate employment. I know plenty women who stayed in positions for years and years, not necessarily happy, but you do get caught up in the prestige. I remember when I left, you had to do some self-identification and figure out, okay, without this title and without this, who am I and where do I fit? But what do corporate leaders, particularly now that you're in a different place, you're a DE&I executive, so you see kind of the challenges. What do corporate leaders need to appreciate and understand about the missed opportunities to truly invest and engage their diverse talent prior to them getting to a point where they realize, you know what? I'm tired. I realize it's not going to happen here, and I'm about to make the next jump. Because right now, there are more jobs than people can fill. Remote opportunities we're not as bound to the Midwest and to Indiana as, quite frankly, a lot of big employers have gotten very comfortable saying, well, it's all Indiana people. You don't have to be from Indiana, and you don't have to only work here now because of, all that's happened with COVID. So what would you advise employers who are seeking to retain their talent or recruit diverse talent? What do they need to focus on in making sure that their employees are valued, starting with the employee resource groups? Because you're absolutely right. Those forums provide opportunities, even me as a scientist, where there were not many diverse people, to get with like-minded folks and just have real conversations. And oftentimes, just the conversation itself can help kind of lift you up and boost you up when you're in more isolated situations. But what do our corporate leadership need to focus on to make sure diverse talent stays?
One, I would say they need to be accessible. It's easy to make statements and comments, but if you've never spoken to anyone that's not a direct report to you about what your vision and goals are, and has your organization realized that you're living off an assumption. And I think that's what a lot of folks do, or they put the responsibility on somebody else on their team. But leaders should go out and they should be accessible, so that if there is something going on, people feel comfortable talking to them. And I would say there's, with everything, there's balance. So, there's some people, if you give them access to you, they're going to complain and gripe. So you got to realize you're going to hear some of that. And I equate almost everything to recruiting. When you think you got one job and you got 100 people interested in it, you gotta figure out how to weigh through it. But you gotta be accessible, but then you gotta listen, because sometimes people might not be telling you things you want to hear, and you have to be open. So I would say being accessible, being attentive and listening, and then being open, and then to take action. Everything is a two-sided coin. So there are going to be people that are going to say heads, some are going to say tails, in every situation. But when the tail is wrong, you got to address it. You can't avoid a situation because, some people aren't ready. And it's hard. And that's why leaders are leaders, because they are able to deal with difficult situations, just not the easy street. And we talk a lot about, standing up for the little guy. That's what a leader needs to do, because just in the power of their position, sometimes when they give an edict, people are going to follow it. When they ask a question, people are like, I guess that's, really important. I wish I could say everybody is motivated for the right reasons to do the right thing. They're not. So you just are going to have to navigate through it. But I think leaders, if they want to retain top talent, they're going to have to understand what the culture needs to look like and then be a game changer to make it happen.
Yeah.
And their leadership team is going to have to be on the same page with them. Otherwise, it's going to create barriers and things like that. What I will say is in the community of, Indiana, primarily Indianapolis, since that's where I've been, I've seen differences compared to when I came in the early 90s. I remember walking the halls and every diverse person was waving almost because it was so few and far between.
So rare to see somebody.
And when you saw somebody else who looked like you, and I mean, when I walk through the streets here, it's just different.
Mm-hmm.
It's also different. I mean, I'm looking at you and with your hair. We couldn't wear natural hair, and then somebody told us, we couldn't. And you look, fast forward now, and you talked about the authenticity.
Right.
Somebody can be their authentic self and still be perceived as a business, person. You don't have to be an entrepreneur if you want to wear your natural hair. So that whole, thing about balance is leaders have to realize that success may not always look as it has in the past. Mm-hmm. They may miss out on the next big thing because they prejudged somebody, and that's one of the things that you're scared of. You're like, okay, here are my experiences. I've got to be open, so when somebody who is different, or we might think they might not have anything to offer, you've got to check yourself. Mm-hmm. And you have to lean in instead of leaning away or pushing them off to somebody else, because success looks a lot different than it used to.
Right.
And so I think people, especially leaders, have to be intentional about who's not at the table.
Right.
And why not. Leaders have to set the tone. So if you have a leader that is limited in their focus, that's what's going to, in my opinion, happen within their organization, where if you have leaders that are very open to change, you're going to see a lot of innovation. It doesn't mean it's going to be right every time. You can't be risk adverse. You can't be afraid to fail.
Right.
With a person, you just got to pick it back up and keep working at it.
Right. So Holli, you mentioned that, you've been here 30 years, you've seen how things change. You just mentioned, even 20 years ago, you were told you couldn't wear natural hair. Now you see women in natural hair all the time, and that's not even a thing. So given that vantage point, tell us about some of the greatest advances you've seen Indiana companies make as a collective over the last, couple decades, particularly as it reflects or catalyzes into more diverse and inclusive workspaces and corporate environments, but also some of the challenges that you still foresee Indiana companies facing on the DE&I front, particularly from the vantage point of an organization that clearly must value people from everywhere, because you literally have customers and passengers from everywhere and anywhere.
Yeah, what I would say is, I talked about representation. I've seen the demographic change, and not just of the community, but of the leaders in the community. Mm-hmm. And I think when you have African Americans, Hispanic, and Latinos, and women leading companies, they're going to make change to include diversity. They're not going to exclude people who look like them. I don't think that's natural to anyone. So that in itself breeds more equity. But one of the challenges that you see with that is sometimes they're still alone in their sectors. Mm-hmm. And so I still think there's opportunities for us to come together and work together, because one of the challenges is if you have one company that's really good on diversity, equity, has a great culture, and you're a person who is like, I don't like that, you can bounce to another company.
Right.
And if that company doesn't have that, there are different initiatives going on. One is the BEI, Business Equity for Indy, where they're trying to bring everybody together so that people can't jump from company, but everybody has similar focuses. And I think that's really going to make a big difference. I'm part of the procurement group where we're really trying to zone in on how do we make a difference in supplier diversity, and we're sharing who the diverse businesses are. Because one of the biggest perceptions is you can't find anybody. Well, you got to look. And so by coming together and bringing everybody, we're making a difference. So as you have leaders who have a different, diverse mindset, and you have individuals who are actually different, and we begin to come together, I think we'll make more change in the community, but there's still struggles.
It really is a learning and growth process for us all. I mean, even Jimmy came to a group of us and had a conversation, was like, would you have a problem with this? And this is a diverse group of people, and it was completely split. Some people were like, no, that wouldn't be a problem. Other people were like, yes, that's a problem. So it's not just clearly laid out of what the right thing and the wrong thing, the do's and the don'ts. There are some things, though, that are kind of obvious. But I do
Absolutely.
but I do think, you know, when you start getting in the weeds and really dealing with a corporate organization, who gets promoted and who gets hired, things do get complicated. It's not just easy as black and white, although, you know, pardon the pun. So as we come to a close, Holli, I want to ask you, and I'm going to poke you a little bit, because you said here before we started, you know, the crybabies in the house. I know you are like me. It just comes with age. You become more sensitive and more emotional and more thankful.
Yeah.
You know, I don't take things for granted anymore. I don't just assume that my son, who we talked about earlier, is going to drive and make it home. You know, there are things that you become a lot more aware of and a lot more appreciative about. And so as you think about, you know, where you've come from, where you are now, what this Indianapolis culture looks like going forward, as I know you have kids who are getting ready to get out here in the world or have just done that. I do too. And so that puts a different lens on things when you're dealing with it versus you knowing your kids are going to have to deal with some of these challenges and inequities. What would you suggest to any of our Indiana leaders who are serious about recruiting and hiring and retaining diverse talent, particularly diverse talent that's homegrown? They are born here, they're raised here, they've grown up here, but so many are looking to, as soon as they have an opportunity, I'm trying to go. To keep that talent here in the state, and certainly everybody goes away. I went away from home too, but at least come back or have plans to come back when the time is right. What do you think we as Indiana leaders can continue to do or start doing to make our young talent want to settle here and start life here and make, you know, this community better versus leaving and going and making some other community better?
Yeah, one of the things we talk about a lot is that organizations here, I don't think, share the good. So one of the examples I shared, I remember when I moved here, the only thing I heard is there's more to Indiana than corn, but I didn't know what that was.
Right.
And I think, you know, my viewpoint is in Indianapolis and Indiana is kind of the crossroads. We're central.
Right.
There's a lot that passes through here, and we don't tell our own story about what is good. You know, everybody knows I'm a diehard Detroiter, but I mean, this has been my home for 30 years. Yeah. So you still want the community here to thrive.
Right.
And I think one of the focuses is reaching out. It's never too early to start. And what I'd also like to it's never too early to make a good or bad impression. So from a corporate responsibility standpoint, reaching out as, you know, K through 12.
Right.
What are you doing? There's some amazing programs. There was LEAD. Now there's the program with Providence Crystal Ray where they're getting students exposed to a corporate experience. You've got the Employee Indy and MAP and Ascend initiatives that are taking place. Is how do you find out how to reach and make a positive impression early?
Yeah, that's right.
And sometimes, you know, like I said, you may come across a young person, they're like, I don't want to do that. But helping them navigate to what they might like and away from what they don't is still a good thing.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's important to start earlier if we're trying to attract, because things happen in cycles. So I think you and I are in the group where our parents were like, you need a corporate job and you need to rise to the top and you need to get a 401k. I mean, so we were gung-ho. I think our kids have seen the good and bad. Some have seen us thrive and some have seen us struggle. And so they're like, I don't know if I want to do that.
Right. Yeah.
And so what's that next generation? We have an opportunity to shape, to say you can be anything. You can come work in corporate America, or you can be a provider of supplies or services,
right,
or work to support projects at an organization. But how do we help the young folks map their way so they want to be a part of this versus shying away from it? And not just the work, but the community. They need to see how we are working together. So we need to support the different initiatives that are happening. We need to support the Asian Alliance. They just had that awesome International Day, which, I wasn't able to stay for the whole, but it was awesome. But we should be participating. The number of youths that were there, we've got IBE, coming up. We've got programs like Center for Leadership Development.
Absolutely.
We got Dress for. We all need to be present, and not just as organizations being a part of these programs to check a resume, but really leveraging that to build and attract up and coming youth to our community.
Yeah.
And so I think we've got what we call the secret sauce and the right things. We just have to be intentional and work together to make sure, young people see, look at how I could thrive. This organization is thriving, and they could see themselves thriving with us.
So with that, Holli, I thank you so much for sharing with us. Do you have any last thoughts? One thing I do want to mention, it is LGBTQ Pride Month. Are there any particular things that the airport is doing to emphasize and celebrate our LGBTQ family in Indianapolis?
Yes. Well, one of the things on the supplier diversity side, I don't know how many people are aware that we have an Indy Rainbow Chamber. And so like the city of Indianapolis does certification, the state does the MBE, WBE, BBE. There is a national NGLCC certification, and there's an organization here that people can be a part of. We recently became a part of it and are trying to work more from a supplier diversity standpoint. One of the learnings I would say we had is when you look at all of our materials, historically it talked about minority, women, veteran.
Right.
And DBE, which is disadvantaged, that's a federal certification. Our mindset was everybody was included, but I had a conversation if you don't see it, you're not sure.
Right.
And the reason we didn't include it is because there was no goal. But even though there's no goal, there is an opportunity to participate in our program. So in our most recent diversity brochure, we added it.
Right.
And we also joined the Rainbow Chamber so we can make sure we're sending out information and that community knows you can work.
Yeah, that's right.
At the airport. We will be participating in the upcoming Pride Parade and are very excited.
Yes.
And then there's an Outcare organization that is also having a gala, and we're going to be participating in that. And just excited, and you've got to have, conversations. Yeah. I think there have been a lot more conversations within the organization where employees are beginning to share and talk despite concerns about bias in the broader community. And I think by attending these events, again, what I talked about earlier is experiences. If you don't have that experience, everything you're second guessing. But once you start participating, you can learn about different perspectives. And you've heard me talk about when it's on your street, when you know somebody,
right,
then you want to support them. But if you're not in a place where you can meet somebody, you're never going to learn and broaden your perspective and maybe shift your attitude.
thank you for all you at the airport are doing for this community. I mean, it really is amazing for Indianapolis to be named as the best airport in North America for the last decade, not just once or twice, the last decade. That's awesome. And I know that has only been a result of so many good people like yourself and Mario and so many others I know out there really caring about that organization, caring that Indianapolis is viewed in a beautiful perspective as soon as people land here. And we just thank you for all you all do to make Indianapolis such an awesome community that me and you have both chosen to stay and call home. So thank you for all you do, and it's great to have you here.
All right. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you again to Holli Harrington, and thanks to you for joining us on this 11th episode of IBJ's The Freedom Forum with Angela B. Freeman. Please come back next month for another conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Central Indiana business community.